The frost came down over the parking lot at 4:40 in the morning, and Josephine Hartigan scraped it off her windshield with an expired bank card, because her ice scraper had snapped back in November, and she had not yet found a reason strong enough to buy another one. She noticed the cold the way she noticed most inconveniences. She noted it. She calculated what it would cost her. Then she got on with things. She went into the diner kitchen before opening to get the onions cut and the stock on the heat, and the manager came to the door and called her name in a tone that said she had done something wrong by being useful before she was on the clock. She had not. She had only done what needed doing. Josie was 7 and 20. She was not rich. She was not beautiful, or not the kind of beautiful a room remembers, but the kind people look past to find the person they actually came to see, which suited her, because it meant they did not ask her questions she did not want to answer. She had a car 42,000 miles past its last service, a 19-year-old brother in his first year of college, whose tuition she paid, a stack of collection letters for $41,000 that she no longer opened but still kept, and her mother's cast-iron skillet, which she had carried out of the old house the day they came to take it, because someone had told her the skillet belonged to the property, and Josie had explained quietly, without raising her voice, that it belonged to her mother, and she would be taking it. That afternoon she stopped at the ironworks to have the loose handle riveted, then left it in a cloth bag on the passenger seat, and forgot about it. She did not know that in less than 12 hours, on a corner 3 blocks from where she was standing, that skillet would be in her hand for the 3 seconds in which her whole life turned in a different direction, and she did not know that across the street that night a man would be sitting in a car watching her do it. A man whose name everyone in Federal Hill knew, and nobody said out loud. If this story has held you this far, tap like so I know you are listening. Share it with someone you think needs to hear about a woman who was decent when no one was watching. And subscribe to the channel, because there are many more stories like this one waiting for you. Josie's delivery shift began at 6 o'clock in the evening and ended at 2 o'clock in the morning. And during those 8 hours, she moved to a rhythm her body had memorized so completely that her mind barely needed to take part. The insulated delivery bag went over her right shoulder. The keys stayed pinched between the index and middle fingers of her left hand, not because she was afraid, but because it saved her from digging through her coat pocket when both hands were occupied. She had learned how to read a building from the street, how to study the rows of buzzers and know whether there was an elevator, how to look at a third-floor window and guess whether the stairwell light was working or had been broken for years. In Olneyville, there were 2 buildings where the stairs were completely dark from the second landing upward, and Josie climbed them by counting the steps, 13 to a floor, her left hand tracing the wall, her right hand supporting the bottom of the bag so the soup wouldn't tilt. She never let the soup tilt. That was the one thing about this job she allowed herself to have an opinion about. Tips came in $1 bills, sometimes 2 of them. Occasionally a fistful of loose change poured into her palm with an apology, and she accepted every amount with the same thank you, in the same voice, because she had seen too many delivery workers change their tone according to the size of the tip, and she didn't want to become that kind of person. Some nights she made $60. Some nights she made $22. She wrote down both numbers with the same stroke of the pen. That Tuesday night, she reached the apartment at 2:20, and the desk lamp in the living room was still on, which meant Owen was awake. He was sitting on the floor with a book balanced across his knees and the old laptop open beside him, and without looking up, he said she was later than usual. Josie said she'd had an order all the way out in Cranston. She took off her coat, washed her hands under hot water until her fingers could move properly again, then pulled 3 $10 bills from her pocket, bills she had already smoothed flat, and placed them on the table beside his book. Owen looked at the money, then at his sister. He said she didn't need to give him anything this week. Josie said the tips had been good. He looked at her for another second. The kind of second when a 19-year-old younger brother is beginning to understand that his sister is lying, but still doesn't know what to do with that knowledge. Then he picked up the money and said, "Thank you." Josie asked what chapter he was on. He said chapter 7. She told him to sleep before 1 o'clock, and he said he would, and they both knew he wouldn't. In her room, she did 3 things in the same order she had followed for the past 2 years. The first was opening the second drawer of the small cabinet beside her bed. Inside was a stack of envelopes, each one stamped with a red seal in the corner, and the newer red seals were darker than the old ones. She picked up the 2 letters that had arrived that day, didn't open them, placed them at the bottom of the stack in the proper date order, then pushed the drawer closed. She didn't open any of them. She knew what they said inside. The second thing was sitting on the edge of the bed and taking the notebook from her coat pocket. It was small, hard-covered, spiral-bound, the kind sold at a drugstore for less than $2. She opened to the page she hadn't finished and recorded the entire evening shift. 17 deliveries, the address of each one, the pickup time and delivery time, the amount of the tip. Beside the 9th delivery, she added 4 words. Elevator broken again. Beside the 14th, she wrote, customer not home. Waited 11 minutes. She wrote in small, even block letters without a slant, the handwriting of someone who had once studied cooking and was used to writing recipes on index cards. She had written that way since she was 16, when her mother told her that people could only argue with what nobody had written down. 11 years now. The third thing was putting the notebook away. In the closet, beneath a stack of winter clothes, there was an old shoebox filled with notebooks she had written full, their spiral bindings turned inward, the oldest one resting at the bottom. She had counted them one night a long time ago, and had never counted them again. She didn't keep them for any particular reason. She kept them because she was the kind of person who didn't throw away things she had written down. She turned off the light at 2:50. She slept for 4 hours. And inside that shoebox, beneath the stack of winter clothes, unknown to anyone, including her, there was already something waiting that, 2 years later, would cause a 61-year-old man to lose everything he had. There was one standing order every Tuesday night that the dispatcher always assigned to Josie, and she had been taking it for 7 months without ever asking why it was given to her. The order came from an Italian restaurant on Atwell Street. Always the same list of dishes, always 3 large bags, and the destination was a brownstone house on the hill in Federal Hill, through the back kitchen door, not the front entrance. The first time she went there, the dispatcher gave her 2 instructions. Use the back door. Don't stay in the driveway too long. Josie did exactly that and asked nothing more. The person who always came to collect the food was Bertie Lombardo, a small woman in her 60s who opened that door with the ease of someone who had opened it tens of thousands of times. She took the bags with both hands, glanced over them to see which containers needed to be eaten hot first, then paid in cash, always an even amount above the bill, and always placed the money directly into Josie's hand rather than setting it on the table. That Tuesday night was colder than usual, and Bertie kept the door open for 1 extra moment after taking the bags. She asked Josie whether she'd eaten dinner. Josie said she had. Bertie said she didn't believe her, in a voice that carried no reproach at all, then turned back into the kitchen and brought out a paper container that had clearly been wrapped beforehand, something she had obviously prepared before she knew what Josie's answer would be, and placed it in her hands. Josie accepted it because refusing would take longer than accepting, and because she had learned that some people gave simply because they wanted to give, not because they wanted to be thanked. Josie knew whose house this was. The whole neighborhood knew. People knew it the way they knew which streets were one way and where the potholes were, a kind of knowledge no one needed to explain and no one repeated aloud. At the diner where she worked the morning shift, there were names people said in ordinary voices, and names they said half a shade quieter, and the name attached to this house belonged to the second kind. Josie had never asked anyone anything about it. She took the bags, she used the back door, she counted the change, she left. Bertie watched her for a moment, then said, "Most people ask," she went on. "Most people ask the second time. Some ask the first time, and some don't ask, but they stand there longer than they need to so they can look inside." Josie said, "I'm not most people." Bertie gave a short laugh, the kind of laugh that came from someone who had just heard the answer she'd been waiting for. Then she said, not quite to Josie, but almost to herself, as she straightened the paper bags, that every Thursday night the boss took the car out alone. No driver, no one with him, leaving at 8 o'clock and coming back close to midnight, every single week, and he'd been doing it for 3 months. She said even Sal didn't know where he went, and Sal knew everything. Josie didn't ask who Sal was. She told Bertie goodnight and turned back toward her car. On the way down the hill, she thought about the warm paper container sitting on the passenger seat, and she didn't think any further about Thursday night, because at that moment it wasn't her concern. Thursday was still 3 days away. Thursday came, and it came like every other Thursday. At 9 o'clock that night, Josie parked at the end of Atwell Street to make 2 back-to-back deliveries in the same row of buildings, and on the passenger seat was still the canvas bag holding the cast-iron skillet she had picked up from the forge that afternoon and forgotten to bring inside when she got home. She slung the canvas bag over her left shoulder because leaving it in a car with a cracked window wasn't wise, then took the insulated delivery bag in her right hand and started walking toward the address across the street. She heard the 3 men before she saw them. They had just come out of the bar on the corner. 3 of them. moving as a loose cluster the way young men do when they have drunk more than they meant to and still aren't ready to go home. They weren't cruel. Josie understood that immediately, and she continued to believe it afterward. They were simply young, bored, far from the place they called home, and they had decided that something fun had to happen tonight, whether tonight agreed or not. In the church parking lot at the end of the block, an old car was parked close to the wall, and an elderly woman sat on a folding chair beside the car door. Josie knew her. Everyone on Atwell Street knew her. Her name was Estelle Ruggiero. She was in her 70s, and she never asked anyone for anything. She simply set a paper cup on the sidewalk and left it there, and anyone who wanted to put something into it could. Josie had dropped money into that cup a few times, always while passing when the old woman happened to be looking the other way. The three men saw the cup. They saw it the way young men who had drunk too much sometimes saw anything that stayed still and couldn't defend itself. The one in the middle, the biggest of the three, kicked the cup with the toe of his shoe, and the coins scattered across the pavement with a bright clatter, and the other two laughed. Estelle bent down to pick them up, and while she was bent over, one of the three men knocked aside the plastic bag sitting beside her chair, the bag that held several containers of medicine, and it fell into the gutter where the rainwater from that afternoon still hadn't fully drained away. The old woman stopped. She didn't cry out. She sat upright in the folding chair and didn't move. And Josie knew that kind of stillness very well. It wasn't fear. It was the stillness of someone calculating the odds, weighing what direction things would go if she stood up, what direction they would go if she stayed seated, and which direction would bring the whole thing to an end faster. The biggest man stepped forward and planted himself between her and the car door. Josie set the insulated bag down on the sidewalk. She placed it down carefully, because there was soup inside, and because she needed her hands free. Then she crossed the street. She didn't run. This wasn't the kind of thing you ran toward. You walked toward it at an even pace so that when you arrived, you still had your breath and your voice, because in the first 3 seconds, your voice was the only thing you had. She moved around the big man's left shoulder and stepped into the exact space between him and the car door, and in the same voice she used when a child was about to do something that couldn't be taken back, she said, "She has a heart condition. Step back." The biggest man turned and looked at her. He was almost a full head taller than she was and nearly half again as broad, and he looked at her the way men like that sometimes looked at women like Josie, with suspicion mixed with a trace of amusement, as though he couldn't quite believe this was really happening. He asked who she was. Josie said, "I'm the person who just told you to step back." One of the other two men laughed. The biggest man glanced at his friends and seemed to conclude that the evening had just become more interesting than expected. He turned back to her and asked, "Or what?" The skillet was inside the canvas bag hanging from Josie's left shoulder, and it was there because she had stopped by the forge that afternoon, for no other reason. She didn't plan what happened next, at least not in the sense that she had decided on it beforehand. The calculation happened the way all of her calculations did, quickly, completely, and without ceremony. She pulled the skillet from the canvas bag and struck him once across the shoulder and upper arm with the flat side of it. He went down. He didn't fall dramatically. He fell the way large, heavy things fall when they are hit in the right place, all at once and without warning. He landed sitting on the sidewalk with one hand gripping his shoulder and the expression of a man who felt more insulted than hurt, while the other two men stood perfectly still. Josie looked at them, one at a time, and then both at once. They came to the conclusion that this wasn't the kind of fun they had been looking for. The entire corner went silent for a beat. Then someone laughed. A short sound, almost helpless. Then someone else did. Then the owner of the sandwich shop on the corner said something Josie couldn't quite hear, and the whole block erupted in laughter, and the biggest man got to his feet on his own and walked back the way he had come, with as much dignity as he could manage, while the other two followed without needing to be told. When they reached the point where the street turned out of sight, the biggest man looked back at her once. He didn't say anything. Then he was gone. Josie set the skillet down on the sidewalk and walked over to the gutter. The plastic bag was lying on its side in a puddle left from the afternoon rain, and she pulled it out, drained the water from it, then took out each box of medicine one by one and wiped it against the hem of her coat until the paper was dry enough for her to read the labels. There were 4 boxes. She put them back in the exact order they had been lying inside the bag, tied the torn handle with a simple knot, then carried it over. Estelle was still sitting on the folding chair, her back straight, both hands resting in her lap. Josie didn't hand the bag down to her from above. She lowered herself onto her heels in front of the old woman so their eyes were level, placed the bag in her lap, and said, "They're gone. They won't come back." Estelle didn't take hold of the bag right away. She looked at Josie, And there was something in that look Josie couldn't name. Not quite gratitude, perhaps recognition, the look of someone who had just seen something again that she had believed no longer existed, and was checking to make sure she hadn't remembered it wrong. Then she placed both hands on the bag and said that she took her heart medicine at night, and she'd already taken it, so she was all right. Josie said that was good. The old woman said, "My name is Estelle." Josie said, "I know." The old woman asked, "What's your name?" And Josie, who had never hidden her name from anyone, suddenly felt that if she said it aloud, this would become something between the two of them, and the old woman would have to carry it with her, and Josie didn't want anyone carrying anything because of her. She stood up. In her coat pocket were 3 $20 bills, the tips from 3 nights combined, money she had meant to use for gas the next morning, and to buy the new ice scraper she had been putting off since November. She dropped all 3 bills into the paper cup, set the cup beside the leg of the chair so it wouldn't tip over, and turned away before the old woman could look down. She heard Estelle call something after her from behind, but Josie was already crossing the street. She didn't stay because being thanked embarrassed her. It always embarrassed her, because she didn't believe she had done anything that deserved someone's gratitude. She had simply done what the situation required of whoever happened to be standing in it, and the person standing in it tonight happened to be her. She picked up the insulated bag, checked the soup container, delivered the remaining 2 orders, and the final delivery of the night arrived 20 minutes later than the system time. When she got home close to 2 o'clock, the desk lamp was still on. Owen looked up and saw the long scrape across the back of her right hand, where she had caught it against the edge of the concrete while pulling the bag from the gutter. He asked what had happened to her hand. Josie said the trunk had caught it. Owen looked at her for a beat longer, then said, "Wash it so it doesn't get infected." And Josie said, "Yeah." And that was the end of it. She took the skillet out of the canvas bag, rinsed it under hot water, didn't use soap because her mother had taught her that you didn't wash cast iron with soap, dried it with a towel, then held it over the stove until the last of the moisture burned away and hung it on the hook behind the kitchen door. The handle was still solid. The man at the forge had riveted it back properly. Then she went into her room, opened the second drawer, found that no letters had arrived that day, closed it again, and sat on the edge of the bed with her notebook. She recorded the 19 deliveries from Thursday night, the addresses, pickup times, delivery times, tips. When she reached the 17th delivery, she paused with the pen for a moment. Then she wrote, 20 minutes late. Incident on the road. 4 words. She wrote nothing else. She didn't write the name of the street, didn't write about the 3 men, didn't write about the paper cup or the 4 boxes of medicine or the $60. She closed the notebook and put it back in her coat pocket for the next day, turned off the light, and while she lay there waiting for sleep, she thought about how she was going to pay for gas in the morning. And she didn't think at all about the black car that had been parked across the street the entire time, because she had never seen it. The black car turned onto Atwell Street at 9:11, 30 seconds too late for whatever had made the entire corner erupt in laughter, and the man behind the wheel had no idea what he had just missed. Rafael Castellano shut off the engine and sat still, and what he saw through the windshield was a woman crouched beside the gutter, pulling a plastic bag out of a puddle, taking out each box of medicine one at a time, and wiping it against the hem of her own coat. Then she tied the torn handle back together, carried the bag to the old woman sitting nearby, and instead of handing it down from above, she lowered herself onto her heels so their eyes were level. Rafe couldn't hear what she said. He only saw the old woman place both hands on the bag and hold it for a very long time. Then the woman stood up, dropped a handful of money into the paper cup, set the cup beside the leg of the chair so it wouldn't tip over, and turned away immediately, walking fast without looking back, like someone afraid of being stopped. The old woman called something after her. She didn't stop. Rafe sat in the car looking at the corner where she had disappeared, and he stayed there longer than necessary for any practical reason. He wasn't there by accident. For 11 straight weeks, every Thursday night, he had taken the car out alone, no driver, no one with him, circling church parking lots and empty lots on the west side of the city, looking for an old car and a woman in her 70s named Estelle Ruggiero. 30 years earlier, her husband had taken responsibility for something Rafe's father should have answered for, and he had gone through a door and never come back out. The family had taken care of her ever since, not as a favor. As a payment with no final installment, and Rafe had continued paying it for the past 3 years, ever since it had become his responsibility. Then, 11 weeks ago, the money stopped being accepted. The apartment on Sutton Street was empty. She had left no message, told no one where she was going, and people said she had given the building manager exactly 1 sentence before she left, that she'd had enough. Rafe didn't understand what that meant, and he hadn't been able to ask anyone, because the only way to ask was to find her first. He had imagined this meeting many times over those 11 weeks. In every version he had imagined, there had never been a strange woman crouching beside a gutter, wiping medicine boxes against the hem of her coat. He was the head of the Castellano family, and he had never wanted that seat. His older brother, Gio, had been born for it. The man who laughed more than anyone with that much authority had any right to laugh. The man who remembered the name of every worker's wife, and the names of their children too. And Gio had died 3 years ago, leaving behind 2 daughters, a house, a name, and a list of unfinished things. Rafe had taken all of it because someone had to. For the past 3 years, he had devoted himself to one major task, moving everything the family did toward the licensed side of the line, into construction, into real estate, slowly, piece by piece, and there were people who didn't like it and were waiting for him to stumble. He had learned long ago, in a costly way he never spoke about to anyone, that what a person said meant nothing, and how they behaved when someone important was present meant nothing either. What a person did when they believed no one important was watching, that was the complete testimony of who they were. Every other version was performance. He had looked for that truth in brighter places, among people introduced to him far more properly, and he had found very little of it. He hadn't expected to find it here. Rafe got out of the car after the sidewalk had emptied. He walked over to Estelle, and she recognized him immediately, and she said she knew someone would come looking eventually, and Rafe said he'd been looking for 11 weeks. She said she wasn't accepting anything anymore. He asked why. She looked at him for a while, then said that some debts could be paid forever and still never be paid off. And when a person reached a certain age, they wanted to know whether they still owed anyone anything, so they could leave this world carrying less weight. Rafe didn't answer that. He asked what she needed. She said she didn't need anything, then pointed to the paper cup beneath the chair and said, "She just put everything she had in her pocket into this, and she left before I could even ask her name." Rafe looked at the cup. He went back to the car and sat there for a while longer before starting the engine. At midnight, he called Sal Mancuso. He said, "I need to know who she is." Sal was silent for 3 seconds, then said, "Rafe, don't." Rafe said, 9 days. Do it properly, and hung up before Sal could say anything else. It began on Tuesday night the following week. Josie got out of the car at 6 o'clock in the evening and found the passenger side window shattered into a cloudy white spiderweb, while the area around the door handle was dented inward as though someone had struck it with something short and hard. Nothing inside the car was missing. That was the first thing she noticed, and it was also the thing she didn't understand. The insulated delivery bag was still there, along with a toolbox and some loose change in the cup holder, and everything remained untouched. She swept the broken glass into a paper bag, fitted a piece of cardboard over the opening, taped around the edges, and arrived 40 minutes late for her night shift. 2 days later, the front left tire went flat while the car was parked, and the man at the tire shop on Broad Street showed her the cut in the sidewall and said, "This wasn't a nail, this was a knife," and he looked at her as though he was waiting for an explanation. Josie didn't have one. She paid $115 for the replacement tire and asked nothing more. That Friday, the diner where she worked the morning shift lost its food supply contract, and the manager stood in the kitchen doorway and said the old supplier had suddenly stopped delivering. No explanation, just said they were out of stock, and the new place charged 30% more, so for the next 2 weeks the diner would have to cut hours. He didn't look at her when he said the next part. He said Josie was down to 2 shifts a week. She asked which 2. He said Tuesday and Saturday. She said all right, and took off her apron. And she didn't ask why. Out of everyone who worked there, the person losing the most hours was the one who always arrived earliest, because she was smart enough to know that when a man wouldn't look you in the eye, asking more questions wasn't going to get you the truth. What Josie couldn't do was fit the 3 things together. She had lived through enough months when everything broke at once, and she knew bad luck had a rhythm of its own. But bad luck didn't cut through a tire sidewall. Bad luck didn't smash a window and leave everything inside untouched. And bad luck didn't make a supplier of 20 years suddenly run out of stock during the exact same week everything else started breaking. 3 times, 3 things, in 9 days. Coincidence didn't work like that. Josie knew it, and she also knew she had no way of finding out who was doing it. So she put the thought in the same place where she kept everything she couldn't solve immediately. On Monday, there was another envelope in the mailbox. The red seal in the upper right corner was darker than every seal before it, and beneath it was another line of small print she could see through the paper, without opening the envelope. She didn't open it. She carried it into her room, opened the second drawer, placed it at the bottom of the stack in proper date order, then closed the drawer again. On the refrigerator was a reminder about Owen's spring tuition payment, due on the 8th, and that day was the 27th. Wednesday night, she sat in the car behind the diner and counted her cash. She counted it twice, then wrote the total in the corner of her notebook. She subtracted the rent, subtracted the electric bill, subtracted the tire, subtracted the gas she would need for the next 2 weeks, then looked at the number that remained and started over from the beginning, more slowly this time, because she thought she must have added something wrong. She calculated it 3 times. The number didn't change. She was short by more than half. Josie sat still in the car for about a minute with the notebook open on her lap, and during that minute she allowed herself to feel exactly what a person in that situation was allowed to feel. No more. Then she closed the notebook. She took the roll of tape from the toolbox, got out of the car, added another layer around the edge of the cardboard covering the broken window because the cold wind was cutting into the entire right side of her body, then got back behind the wheel and finished the remaining 4 deliveries of the night. She came home at 2:10, gave Owen $30, said the tips had been good that week, and recorded 15 deliveries in her notebook before turning off the light. Bertie called on Tuesday afternoon, the very day Josie always made the standing delivery, but she didn't call through the restaurant. She called Josie's number directly, something she had never done before. She said the boss wanted to see her at 6 o'clock, at the house, and she said it the way someone might announce a train departure time rather than deliver an order. Josie asked whether it was about the delivery. Bertie said she didn't know, and Josie understood that she did. She arrived at 5:55, and she carried her notebook in her coat pocket because she didn't go to meet anyone without records. And if this was about the deliveries, she had the date and time of every run she had made over the past 7 months. Bertie led her through the kitchen into a front room, where a fire was burning in the fireplace, and a dark wood desk stood near the center, then closed the door and left. The man stood by the window with his back to her, his hands in his coat pockets, and he didn't turn around right away. He was looking down at the driveway. Without turning his head, he asked how long this had been happening. Josie walked close enough to follow his line of sight, and saw her car parked below, the cardboard and layers of tape covering the broken window clearly visible beneath the outdoor lights. She didn't answer. He turned around. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with short black hair and gray eyes, and he carried himself like a man accustomed to rooms waiting for him, rather than a man accustomed to waiting for rooms. He said his name was Rafael Castellano, and Josie said she knew, because she did, and everyone in the neighborhood knew. He indicated the chair across from him. She sat down. He took the seat on the other side of the desk, and said he had been on the corner of Atwell Street that Thursday night. Josie said nothing. She hadn't told anyone about that night in 3 weeks, not even Owen, and now it was lying on the desk between them even though she hadn't put it there. He said he had arrived 30 seconds too late and hadn't seen the part the whole street had seen. He said what he had seen was a woman crouching beside the gutter, wiping medicine boxes against the hem of her own coat. Josie looked down at her hands, then back up at him, and she asked the question she had been holding inside her chest for 3 weeks, the question she had decided she would never ask anyone because asking it meant admitting she was afraid. She asked, "Was it you?" He understood immediately what she meant. He didn't ask her to clarify, didn't pretend not to understand, didn't stretch the moment by even 1 second. He said, "No." Then he said, "But I know who it was." Josie sat very still. She asked who. He said, "I'm not going to tell you." She asked why. He said, "Because if you know his name, you'll go looking for him." Josie opened her mouth to tell him he had no right to make that decision for her, then closed it again, because she realized he was right, and because she hated that he was right. Both things at the same time. He let the silence remain. Then he said he had a job for her, cooking for the household during the day, taking the 2 children to school in the morning and picking them up in the afternoon, 6 days a week. And then he told her the salary. It was nearly 3 times everything she was making from her 2 diner shifts and her night deliveries combined. Josie didn't answer immediately. She thought about the tuition reminder on the refrigerator, due on the 8th. She thought about the number she had recalculated 3 times in the car. She thought about what her mother would say if she were still alive, and Josie knew exactly what she would say. She would say, "You take that job, and you keep your back straight when you take it." Then Josie said she would accept, and she said she had conditions. He gave one nod, meaning go on. She said she cooked, she drove the 2 children to school and picked them up, and that was all. She wouldn't carry anything for anyone, wouldn't hold anything for anyone, wouldn't take anyone's message, and wouldn't deliver anyone's message. She wouldn't answer the door, no matter how many times the bell rang, and no matter who was standing outside. She wouldn't be present in any room where business was being discussed. And if she accidentally walked into a room like that, she would leave immediately. And if there ever came a day when this job required anything beyond what she had just described, she would leave that same day, without notice and without explanation. He listened to all of it without interrupting once. When she finished, he was silent long enough for her to understand that he was genuinely considering what she had said, rather than merely waiting out of politeness. Then he said, "Those are fair terms," Josie said. "Then I start Monday." She stood up, and as she walked out, she told herself she was taking the job because she needed the money. And that was true, and it was reason enough for anyone who might ask. But there was another reason she didn't tell him, didn't tell Bertie, and didn't write in her notebook. There was exactly one person in the world who knew who had smashed her car window, who had slashed her tire, who had caused her to lose 4 shifts a week, and that person had just been sitting across a desk from her. Being close to him meant being close to the answer. On Monday, Josie arrived at 6:30 in the morning, and Bertie was already standing at the kitchen door with a ring of keys. She showed her which one opened the back door, which one opened the pantry, which one opened the freezer out on the porch, then kept the keys in her hand for one extra beat before passing them over and said exactly one thing: "Don't try to make anyone happy. They can smell it right away." Josie said, "I'm not planning to." Bertie said, "I know. I'm only saying it because somebody should," and went outside to bring in the trash bins. The first breakfast was eggs and toast, because those were things no one could have an opinion about. Tessa came down first, 12 years old, sat in her usual place, straightened her fork, then looked at Josie and asked in the calmest voice in the world how long the person before her had lasted. Josie said she didn't know. Tessa said 4.5 months. And the one before that had lasted 2 months. And the one before that she couldn't remember because she had still been little. Then the girl asked how long Josie planned to stay. Josie set the plate down in front of her and said she couldn't promise because she didn't know, and she didn't tell people things she didn't know. She added that if there ever came a day when she was leaving, she would tell Tessa beforehand instead of letting her find out by coming downstairs one morning and seeing someone else standing in the kitchen. Tessa looked at her. She didn't say thank you, didn't nod, didn't soften. She simply went quiet and began to eat. And Josie realized the girl was recalculating everything from the beginning, placing her in a different compartment from the one she had prepared before Josie ever walked into the house. Poppy came down afterward, 8 years old, and the first thing she said to Josie wasn't a greeting but a question. She watched Josie slice the loaf of bread and asked whether bread felt sad when it was cut. Josie thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it, because she had learned long ago that children always knew when an adult was giving them an answer just to finish the conversation. Then she said she didn't think so. Poppy asked why. Josie said because bread was baked to be shared among many people, so being cut was the thing it had been waiting for. Poppy seemed satisfied with that answer. She didn't ask anything else and finished both slices. The first 3 weeks passed according to a rhythm Josie established, and then kept unchanged. She arrived at 6:30. Breakfast was at 7:15. At 7:40, she drove the 2 girls to school in the family car, not her own. During the day she cooked, organized the pantry, and learned that kitchen by heart. At 3 in the afternoon she picked them up. Dinner was at 6. She didn't ask anyone a question unless it had something to do with the meals. She didn't enter the front room with the fireplace when the door was closed, and on some days that door stayed closed from morning until night. Wednesday evening of the 3rd week was the night before Poppy's school science fair. The girl spread her model of the solar system across the dining table, the room brightly lit, the doorway into the kitchen open, while Bertie stood at the sink washing dishes and called out that she'd better not get glue on her table. Poppy attached the planets to their supports and muttered the presentation to herself, then forgot the middle section, started over from the beginning, and forgot at exactly the same place. Josie pulled out a chair and sat beside her, picked up the sheet the girl had written by hand, and read each sentence aloud, slowly, so Poppy could repeat after her. The girl repeated after her. By the 4th time, she didn't forget anymore. Poppy asked what she should do if the teacher asked her a question tomorrow that wasn't on the paper. Josie said, "You tell her you don't know, then you tell her you'll find out, and that's a correct answer." Poppy said, "That's too easy." Josie said, "Most correct answers are easy. People are just embarrassed to say them." At the dining room doorway, Rafe stopped. He had been passing through on his way upstairs, and he paused there, outside the pool of light from the lamps, and listened to the entire 4th run-through of the presentation, and the answer about saying, "You didn't know when you didn't know." Bertie saw him from the kitchen and said nothing. He didn't come inside. He stood there a little longer, then continued up the stairs, and no one in the dining room knew he had been there. Sal Mancuso brought the file over Friday night, exactly 9 days after he had been given the assignment, not a day earlier, because when Rafe said 9 days, Sal understood that he meant 9 days. He set it down on the dark wooden desk in the front room and didn't sit. He said most of what was in there was what Rafe had already guessed. 7 years doing delivery work and kitchen work, 3 places, never fired from any of them, no police record, a younger brother in his first year at community college, tuition paid by his sister, every term paid in full. Mother died 2 years ago. Father left a long time ago, no contact. Then Sal turned to the 4th page, placed his finger on one line, and said, "This part, I think you should read yourself." The line said, Maeve Hartigan, night shift custodian, Castellano Hall on Dean Street, 9 years. Rafe read it a second time. He knew that hall. He had stood on the small stage there at Gio's wedding, and he had stood at the back of the room during 2 funerals, and he had walked through it several hundred times in his life, without once thinking about who cleaned the floors after midnight. 9 years. He sat down. He told Sal to wait. Then he opened the bottom drawer on the right side of that desk, the drawer he opened no more than a few times a year, and took out Gio's leather-bound notebook, the thing they had returned to him along with Gio's watch and wallet 3 years earlier. He had never read all of it. He turned to the final pages, the pages containing words no one had read after they were written, and began working backward from the last blank page. On the 3rd page from the end, between a list of small errands, there was a line written quickly in blue ballpoint ink. "Take care of Mrs. H's hospital bill, remind Sal Monday." Rafe looked at the date written at the top of the page. He sat perfectly still for a very long time, long enough for the fire in the hearth to sink another level and for Sal to shift his weight from one foot to the other. 10 days. That line had been written 10 days before the night Gio didn't come home, and the Monday mentioned in that note was a Monday that never came, and the woman called Mrs. H remained in the hospital for another 14 months after that. And during those 14 months the bills kept piling up, and when she died the balance left behind was $41,000, and the person who had to carry it was a 25-year-old woman who had just buried her mother. Rafe knew the amount because it was on page 6 of the file Sal had just placed on the desk. He set his brother's notebook down on the desk, left it open to that page, and didn't close it. Sal watched him for a while, then said the only thing he said that entire night. "It wasn't your fault." Rafe said, "It wasn't hers." Those 2 sentences weren't answers to each other, and both men knew it. Sal left at 9 o'clock. Rafe remained there alone until nearly 11, and during that time he did what he always did when something needed to be dealt with. He worked out the route. Paying the $41,000 directly to the hospital was pointless, because the hospital had sold that debt a long time ago, the way they sold all overdue debts from this part of the city, bundled together for a few cents on the dollar. He knew where those debts had gone, because in this city, there was only one man who bought things like that. Then he did the thing he should have thought through more carefully. He picked up the phone and called Emil Falconetti for the first time in 2 years. Emil answered on the 4th ring and said he had to look at the screen twice because he thought he had read it wrong. Rafe said he wanted to buy the Federal Hill medical debt portfolio, the entire bundle, at market price. 1 payment. Emil asked what he wanted the entire portfolio for. Rafe said because he was moving everything toward the clean side of the line, and medical debt belonging to people in the neighborhood wasn't something he wanted to see on the books of anyone carrying this family's name. It was a truthful answer, and it was also an incomplete one, and Emil Falconetti had spent 61 years in the business of reading answers like that. He was silent for 3 seconds. Then he laughed, a short, warm laugh, the laugh of a man who had just received a gift on a day when he hadn't been expecting anything at all. He said, "Sounds good, Raphael. Let me look over the portfolio. There are a lot of bundles in this batch. I'll have someone go through them and call you back." Then he hung up, and he remained sitting in his office on the other side of the city. And he didn't review a single portfolio, because in 20 years, no one had ever called Emil Falconetti at 11 o'clock at night asking to buy something they didn't need. He didn't know which name was inside that bundle, but he knew one thing for certain. There was a name in there, and from that second forward, what he was holding in his hands was no longer just paper. Josie heard about it during her Saturday shift at the diner, from the cashier, who had heard it from the owner of the laundromat on Sutton Street, the man who owned a 2-story house with the ground floor rented out. The old woman who had been sitting in the church parking lot now had an apartment. The rent had been paid in advance through June, in cash, delivered by a middle-aged man who was neither the landlord nor a broker, and who had left no name and signed nothing. The laundromat owner said he had asked who the payment was for, and the man had only said, "For Mrs. Ruggiero," then walked away. The cashier added that a car had taken the old woman to see a heart specialist at a private hospital on Blackstone Road, taken her there and brought her home again, twice in 3 weeks. And at that hospital, a single appointment cost as much as an entire month's rent. Josie listened to all of it and said, "Yeah, that's good," then went to finish serving the last 2 tables. Sunday afternoon, she passed by Sutton Street. She hadn't planned to go inside. She had only meant to walk past and see whether it was true. And then Estelle was standing on the front steps with a small potted plant, and she saw Josie first. She said, "Come inside for a minute." The apartment was small, 1 room, with a kitchen and a fireplace, and on the kitchen table sat a pill organizer already arranged by day. Beneath the table, a small brown dog was curled up on a towel, folded into quarters. Estelle said his name was Biscuit, and that he had been sleeping like that for the past 3 weeks, because he couldn't sleep in the car. She poured Josie a cup of tea that Josie hadn't asked for, and couldn't refuse. Josie asked who had arranged the place for her. Estelle said she didn't know. Josie asked, "You didn't ask?" The old woman set down her teacup and said that 74 years of living in this neighborhood had taught her one thing, that there were some gifts you ruined by asking questions about them. She said if someone wanted you to know, they would have told you. If they didn't tell you, it meant they didn't want you carrying the weight of owing them, and if you kept asking until you found out, then you were forcing them to accept something they had deliberately refused. She said she did only one thing. Every night before she went to sleep, she thanked that person silently in her mind, without a name, and that made things even enough. Josie looked at the pill organizer on the table. She thought about the apartment paid through June, about the 2 rides there and back, about the hospital on Blackstone Road. She thought about a man who had been sitting in a car on the corner of Atwell Street that Thursday night and had told her he arrived 30 seconds late. She thought about what he had been doing there, and she realized she had never asked that question, and now she had the answer without needing to ask. She connected the points slowly and completely, the same way she calculated gas money and rent in her car. Then she finished her tea, complimented the little plant, and left. She didn't say anything to Estelle. She didn't say anything to Bertie. Monday morning she arrived at the house at 6:30, made eggs and toast, drove the 2 girls to school, and when Rafe came down to the kitchen for coffee close to 9 o'clock, she said good morning to him, and he said good morning to her, and she didn't ask him a single question. She simply stood there chopping onions and thought that there were people who did good things and left before anyone could thank them, and until that day, she had always thought she was the only one who did that. It happened on a Wednesday evening, after the 2 girls had gone upstairs and Bertie had left, and Josie stayed later than usual, because she had a pot of stock simmering that needed another 40 minutes before she could turn it off. She sat at the long wooden table in the dining room with a cup of coffee, waiting for the time to pass. Rafe walked by, stopped, then asked whether she minded if he sat down. She said, "It's your table," he said. "That isn't an answer to my question." She said she didn't mind. He poured himself a cup and sat at the other end, not beside her, not directly across from her, but 1 chair off at an angle, and for a long while he didn't say anything. Then he asked where she had learned to cook. Josie said she had studied for a 1.5 years at the vocational school on Prairie Road, in a 2-year program. He asked why she hadn't finished, and she told him, not because he pressed her, but because it had been a long time since anyone had asked her a question without already wearing the expression of someone preparing to pity her. She said her mother, Maeve, had found out she was sick in October when Josie was 20. Josie took the spring semester off to work days, and she meant to go back in the fall, and she had held on to that intention for 7 years, the way someone keeps the key to a house that has already been sold. 2 years of treatment. She told it in order. 11 rounds of chemotherapy, 2 surgeries, 4 months in a long-term care ward. She recited it like an itemized statement, the dates correct, the numbers correct, without a single adjective. She said insurance covered part of it until the limit ran out. Then her mother lost her job and lost the insurance with it, and after that the bills became self-pay. She said that in the 2nd year they sold the house in Cranston, the house her mother had been making payments on for 19 years, with 4 years still left. After the sale, they paid off the mortgage, gave everything remaining to the hospital, and there was still $41,000 left. She said she had paid $14,000 over 7 years, and the interest had pushed the balance back to nearly $41,000, and every time she thought she was about to catch up, She discovered she was running on a floor, moving backward beneath her. She said she hadn't opened the letters for the past 2 years, but she kept every one of them in date order in the second drawer. Rafe said nothing. He sat with both hands around his coffee cup and listened to all of it. And as he listened, he knew that for the past 3 weeks, he had already possessed every one of those numbers on paper. Sealed inside a file Sal had placed on a desk less than 10 steps from where he was sitting now. He knew the name of the hall on Dean Street where her mother had cleaned floors after midnight for 9 years. He knew about the line written in blue ballpoint ink in his brother's notebook, 10 days before his brother died, about taking care of Mrs. H's hospital bill and reminding Sal on Monday. He could tell her everything right now. He could tell her that the debt still existed in part because his family had made a promise and hadn't lived long enough to keep it, and that he was trying to buy the debt back, and that a 61-year-old man was now holding it back in exchange for something else. He chose not to say it. He chose consciously, sitting at that dining table while she spoke about 11 rounds of chemotherapy, and the reason he gave himself was that he didn't want her sitting in this house, knowing that she had become a line item in a negotiation between 2 families. That was his reason. Later, he would pay for it. Josie finished her story. She said the final sentence in the same voice she had used for everything before it, that her mother died in February, in the morning, at home, and Owen had been 17 then. Then she went quiet and took a sip of coffee that had already gone cold. Rafe asked exactly one question. He didn't ask about the money, didn't ask about the hospital, didn't ask why she hadn't declared bankruptcy the way some lawyer had surely advised her to do. He asked, "Did she get to know that you were going to be all right?" Josie set down her cup. She didn't answer immediately. She sat very still and looked down at the tabletop, and out in the kitchen the stock continued to simmer gently, and the clock on the dining room wall made a single sound as the minute hand moved. Josie had answered a great many questions about her mother over the past 7 years. What did she have? How long? Where was she treated? How much was still owed? Josie had prepared answers for all of those questions, and she recited them the way she recited delivery addresses. No one had ever asked her this one. A very long time passed before she said, "No." Then she added one more sentence, more softly, that during the last few days, her mother had asked, and Josie had lied. Then she stood up, said the stock was ready, and went into the kitchen. Rafe remained alone at the long wooden table with 2 cups of cold coffee, and he didn't follow her, because at that moment, that was the only thing he could do for her. Josie found it on a Friday afternoon, while cleaning out the bottom drawer on the left side of the kitchen desk. The drawer Bertie called the everything drawer, where there were twist ties, old batteries, a broken bottle opener, and envelopes people dropped in and forgot about. She pulled out a stack of papers to sort through, and in the middle of them was an unsealed white envelope, and inside it was a receipt from the Community College of Rhode Island, fall semester tuition, student name Owen Hartigan, correct student identification number, paid in full, payment method cash. The space for the payer's name was blank. Josie stood there holding the paper in her hand for a long time. The fall semester was the one she had paid for by taking 2 extra night shifts every week for 6 weeks, and she remembered the day she paid it, and she remembered the amount, and she remembered paying in cash counted out from 3 separate envelopes. She read the receipt again. The date on it was September 19th. She had paid on the 11th. Someone had gone to the school 8 days after she made the payment and paid the exact same amount into her brother's account without leaving a name, which meant the money she had already paid was now sitting there as credit toward the next semester, which meant her 2 extra night shifts a week for 6 weeks hadn't disappeared. They had simply been quietly bought back by someone else. She folded the receipt, slipped it back into the envelope, and carried it out to the backyard. Rafe was standing at the end of the driveway, talking on the phone. He saw her and ended the call. It was cold, and neither of them was wearing a coat, and Josie didn't wait for either of them to get warm. She held out the envelope. He looked at it, then at her, and didn't take it. She said, "I'm not thanking you," he said. "I'm not waiting for you to thank me." She said, "Then tell me what you're paying for." She said she had spent the last 20 minutes thinking about it, and couldn't find a single reasonable explanation. She said she had only been working there for 8 weeks. She said people didn't go around paying tuition for the cook's younger brother. They paid the cook her wages, and that was the end of it. Then she asked again, more slowly, "What are you paying for?" Rafe didn't answer. He stood there and endured the question the way a man endures, something he could stop at any moment simply by telling the truth, and he still didn't speak. He didn't speak because he knew that once he started, he would have to tell her everything. About the 9 days, about the hall on Dean Street, about the line written in blue ballpoint ink inside a dead man's notebook, and about the 11 o'clock phone call to a 61-year-old man who still hadn't called him back. He only said, "I'm not answering that question." Josie stood still. She wasn't angry. She was calculating, and he could see her doing it. Then she asked another question, and this one she asked more quietly, because she already knew the answer and only wanted to hear it come from his mouth. She asked, "You sent the doctor for Estelle before you knew who I was, didn't you?" Rafe said, "Yes." She asked, "And the apartment on Sutton Street too?" He said, "Yes." She asked, "And you weren't going to tell anyone who did it either?" He said, "Yes." Josie stood there in the cold for a while longer, still holding the envelope. For 8 weeks she had been trying to place this man into some category, and she hadn't been able to do it, and now she understood why. She had spent her whole life believing people were only kind when someone was keeping count, and everything she had seen over the past 30 years had proven that belief right. She didn't know what to do with a person who broke the rule. She said, "I'm not going to tell Owen." He said, "I was hoping you wouldn't." Then she said, "Thank you." Not for the receipt, but because he had answered those last 3 questions with a single truthful word, instead of inventing some story. He said, "That's the cheapest thing I can give you." She went back inside. That night she got home late, and she sat on the edge of her bed for a very long time with the notebook in her hands and didn't open it. It was the first night in 11 years that she didn't write anything down. 3 days before Christmas, a car pulled into the driveway close to 7 o'clock in the evening, without anyone announcing it beforehand, and Bertie looked out the window and quietly told Josie to set one more place. Josie asked who. Bertie said Adriana Falconetti, and she said the name the way someone might read a line on an electric bill. The 2 girls had finished eating at 6 and had already gone upstairs to do their homework before the car arrived. Dinner was brief. The guests sat to Rafe's right and talked the entire time, about a house in Newport her family was renovating, about flying to Manhattan on the 27th, about how winter in Federal Hill was the same every year, and she couldn't understand why anyone willingly stayed there from November through March. She had a laugh that came in 3 beats, always exactly 3, appearing at moments she herself had decided were funny. Josie brought out the food, poured water, cleared plates, and answered when she was asked something, and she was asked exactly twice during the entire meal. The first time was whether the dish contained cream. The second was how long she had been working there. She said 8 weeks. The guest said, "Oh," and asked nothing else. What Josie noticed wasn't the guest. What she noticed was Rafe. He was courteous, proper, answered at exactly the right moments, passed the salt when asked, and he wasn't there at all. It wasn't coldness. It was something else, a smooth shell with nowhere for anything to catch. And Josie realized that this was the man whose name the whole neighborhood said half a shade more quietly, and the man who had sat at the long wooden table asking whether her mother had gotten to know that she would be all right was nowhere in this room. She registered that while clearing the plates. She realized she didn't like it, and she registered the fact that she didn't like it too, and she found that more troubling information about herself than about him. The next morning, Josie was putting things away in the kitchen hallway when Adriana Falconetti walked in. She didn't raise her voice. She had never needed to. She said she only wanted to talk for a moment, and she let her eyes travel slowly from the worn heels of Josie's shoes to the 2 old oil burns on her left forearm, slowly enough for Josie to understand that the look itself was a statement, rather than merely a look. Then Adriana took a sheet of paper folded into quarters from her bag, placed it on the steel counter, and smoothed it flat with her palm twice, carefully, the way someone smooths a tablecloth. Josie looked down. It was an offer addressed to Emile Falconetti's company, proposing to purchase the entire portfolio of delinquent medical debt from Federal Hill, paid in one lump sum at market price. Rafael Castellano's signature was at the bottom of the page. The date was at the top. Josie read that date twice. It was 11 days before the afternoon Bertie had called her and said the boss wanted to see her at 6 o'clock. Adriana told her to read it carefully. Then she said, "You think he chose you because you're brave?" She said Josie's mother had cleaned the floors at that family's hall for 9 years. She said Rafe's brother had promised to take care of her hospital bills, and then died before he could do it. And that promise was still written inside the dead man's notebook, and Rafe had found it, and within 3 weeks of finding it, he had brought Josie into his house. She said, "This isn't love, Miss Hartigan. This is accounting. There's a column on the left and a column on the right, and you've been entered into the right-hand column, and they're balancing the books, not falling in love with anyone." She added that her father wouldn't sell, would never sell, not because of money, but because some things were worth more than money when you were the only person holding them. Then she spoke more softly, almost intimately, and said that her father would be very angry if he knew she had shown Josie this paper. She said, "I accept that." Josie didn't pick up the paper. She stood straight, her hands still at her sides, and she said nothing for about 5 seconds. And during those 5 seconds, she did exactly what she always did. She calculated how much of what this woman had just told her was true. She concluded that most of it was true, and that was the worst part. Then she said exactly one sentence, very quietly, that she wanted to know who had given Adriana the right to decide for him, and whether he knew she was using it. Adriana didn't answer. Josie walked past her, left the kitchen hallway, and went up the stairs. She placed her hand on the banister at the 3rd step and stopped there. She didn't cry. She had learned a long time ago how not to cry where anyone could see her. She simply stood there with her hand resting on the wood until it stopped trembling, then went upstairs and began tidying the laundry room the way she did every Wednesday morning. That night, Josie didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table in her apartment, with the notebook open to the last blank page, and she did what she always did whenever something had to be decided. She wrote it into columns. On the left were the things she would lose if she quit. She wrote down the amount she had earned over the past 8 weeks, then multiplied it out for a full year, then stared at the number. She wrote Owen's spring semester tuition, due January 8th. She wrote rent, electricity. The remaining half she still owed the repair shop for the front left tire. She wrote the 4 diner shifts that had been cut and showed no sign of coming back. She wrote that the car window was still nothing but cardboard and layers of tape, and she wrote down the price of replacing the glass, the number she had asked for the month before and then set aside. On the right were the things she would gain by staying. She sat looking at the right-hand column for a very long time. Then she wrote exactly one line there, that she would continue eating meals in a house where she was an entry on paperwork she wasn't allowed to know about. She added up the left column. She added it a second time because she thought she had made a mistake on the tuition line. She added it a third time, more slowly, using a pencil. All 3 times gave her the same number, and that number said one thing very clearly, that she couldn't afford to quit. Not that things would be difficult, not that she would have to cut back, that she couldn't afford it, in the mathematical sense. In the sense that by March, she would lose either the apartment or Owen would lose the semester, and she would have to choose between them. She sat with that number until nearly 4 o'clock in the morning. Then she closed the notebook, and she quit. She didn't quit because of pride. She had swallowed things far harder than Adriana Falconetti's words, and she would swallow more if she had to. She quit because of the date on that piece of paper. Because for 8 weeks she had allowed herself to believe she had been invited into that house because of something she had done on the corner of Atwell Street when no one important was watching, and now she knew she had been invited in because of a line written in the notebook of a dead man. She had spent 7 years living beneath a debt. She knew exactly what it felt like to become a number in someone else's ledger, and on some terrible night years ago she had sworn to herself that at least in the rest of her life, she would not be an entry on someone else's account. That morning, she arrived at the house at 6:30 just as she always did. She made breakfast, left it warming in the oven, and wrote on a note for the refrigerator that the eggs were on the middle shelf and the bread had already been sliced. She washed the cast-iron skillet she had brought with her during her first week, because the kitchen in that house didn't have one she liked, dried it, held it over the flame, then set it face up on the kitchen counter. She left the letter beside it. The letter was short. She wrote that she was resigning, effective immediately, and that she was sorry she couldn't give 2 weeks' notice. She wrote that the girls' breakfast was in the oven, that Tessa couldn't eat pepper, and that Poppy needed to be reminded to bring her model box home because she would leave it in her locker. She wrote that she had promised Tessa that if there ever came a day when she left, she would tell her beforehand, instead of letting her come downstairs one morning and find someone else standing in the kitchen, and that she was breaking that promise. And she hoped he would tell Tessa that Josie knew she was breaking it. Then she wrote one final sentence, and it was the only sentence in the letter about herself. She wrote, "I have spent 7 years working to pay a debt. I won't work to become one." She placed the ring of keys on top of the letter so it wouldn't blow away, and she left through the kitchen door while it was still dark outside. She didn't leave the city. She had nowhere to go, and she didn't believe in running away. At noon that day, she went to the diner and asked for her morning shifts back, and the manager said he still only had Tuesday and Saturday, then looked at her face and added Sunday morning. She called the delivery dispatch line and took back the night schedule. 6 o'clock in the evening until 2 o'clock in the morning, 6 days a week. She added another layer of tape around the edge of the cardboard covering the broken window because the December wind cut through more sharply than the November wind had. She slept 4 hours a day. She gave Owen $30 and said the tips had been good that week, and this time he didn't ask anything at all. He only looked at her for a beat longer, then put the money in his pocket. On the night of January 2nd, Josie came home at 2:20, and the desk lamp wasn't on, which meant Owen had gone to sleep. And that was the first thing that felt wrong, because Owen never went to bed before she did during exam weeks. The second thing was that there were 2 objects on the table that didn't belong in this apartment: a thick brown paper envelope, unsealed, and a car key attached to an orange plastic tag, the kind rental lots often used, with no name and no number. Josie stood looking at the 2 things for a while without touching them. Then she counted through the mouth of the envelope with her eyes, without pulling anything out, and estimated that it was thicker than all the money she had ever held at one time in her life. She went into her brother's room. Owen was lying with his face turned toward the wall, and he wasn't asleep. She knew immediately, because the breathing of someone pretending to sleep wasn't the same as the breathing of someone truly asleep, and she had listened to both kinds for years. She sat on the edge of his bed and didn't turn on the light. She didn't ask where the envelope had come from. She didn't ask who had brought it. She asked exactly one question, very calmly: whether he had opened it. Owen lay still for 3 seconds, then said no. Josie said, "Good, then you still have time." He sat up in the dark. Then he told her, and he told everything in one breath, the way a person vomits up something that has been sitting in his stomach too long. 3 weeks earlier, 2 men had been waiting for him in the school parking lot, called him by his correct name, knew which classes he was taking, even knew his mother's name. They said they worked for a company that held his family's medical debt records. They said $41,000, and they gave the amount down to the exact 100. Then they said they could erase the entire thing, not reduce it, not stretch out the payments, but erase it completely, with proper paperwork, and the only thing they needed was for him to drive a few packages for them, a few trips each week, their car, their gas, nothing brought into his home, no need to know what was inside. They said he was a student, had no record, nobody would pay attention to him, and that was why they had come to him instead of someone else. They added one more thing, which Owen repeated to his sister in a quieter voice, that his sister had been paying that debt for 7 years and could keep paying it for another 20 and still never finish. And did he want to watch her keep doing that until she was 47 years old? Owen said he had told them he needed time to think. He thought about it for 10 days. Then he made the first run on the night of December 28th. The second was the night of December 31st. Both runs went from a warehouse in Pawtucket to an address in Attleboro, there and back within 2 hours, and no one said anything to him except the Times. He said he hadn't opened any of the packages. He said today they had given him the envelope and the key, and told him that starting next week it would become more regular. Then he went quiet. Josie didn't shout. She had thought she would. She felt the anger rise inside her chest exactly the way she had imagined it would, and then it passed through her and left something much colder behind. She sat very still in the dark for a long time. She thought about the 2 men who knew her mother's name. She thought about how long they must have been watching this apartment before they approached Owen in the school parking lot. She thought about the shattered car window with nothing stolen, about the slashed tire, about a supplier of 20 years suddenly running out of stock, and she understood that none of those 3 things had ever been aimed at the car or the diner at all. They had been aimed at exhausting one woman so completely that when someone offered her a way out, she would take it, except she hadn't. So they went around her and found her 19-year-old brother instead. Josie asked whether he still had anything from them besides the envelope and the key. He said no. She asked whether he had signed anything. He said no. She asked whether anyone had taken pictures of him at the warehouse or at the delivery point. Owen was silent, then said he didn't know, then said probably. Josie nodded once in the darkness. She said, "Tomorrow morning you go to school like normal. You don't call anyone, you don't message anyone, and if they come looking for you, you tell them you need to talk to your sister first." She said, "You don't have to be afraid of them, but you do have to be careful with them, and those are 2 different things." Owen asked what she was going to do. She said, "I don't know yet." Then she stood up, went into her room, and didn't turn on the light there either. She opened the closet door, reached beneath the stack of winter clothes, and pulled out the shoebox. Josie sat down on the kitchen floor with the shoebox in her lap, and she stayed there until daylight. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She had only one vague thought, that if 2 men knew her mother's name and knew which classes her brother was taking, then they had been around her for longer than 3 weeks. And if they had been around her for longer than 3 weeks, then perhaps she had seen them without knowing it, and the only thing in the world that recorded what Josie Hartigan had seen over the past 11 years was sitting inside this box. She started with the oldest notebook and worked her way forward. By the fourth notebook, she stopped. It was there, and it had been there for 2 years, and she had written it down 4 times a week, without ever once going back to read it. Dean Street, side address beside the laundromat, rear entrance, first floor office, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, always between about 9:15 and 9:40 at night, always between 4 and 7 meals, depending on the evening. And in the notes line, she had always written the name on the invoice, because she always wrote the name on the invoice, because that was how she knew which orders had already been paid and which ones had to be collected on delivery. The name was a construction company, and that construction company's name was one Josie had seen on signs at 3 construction sites around the neighborhood, and all of them belonged to the Castellano family. She kept turning pages. It continued for 2 full years without a break. During those 2 years, there were nights when she had written down license plate numbers because the rear entrance beside the laundromat only had room for 2 cars, and sometimes she had to block one in, and she had a habit of recording the plate number of the car she had blocked in case someone needed to leave and had to find her. There were 17 license plate numbers spread across 4 notebooks. There were nights when she wrote down the number of people because inside they told her to leave the food on the outer table, and she counted the chairs that had been pulled out. One night she had written that the rear door was locked, so she had to go around through the laundromat entrance, and another night she had written that the customer paid in cash because the company card had been declined, and she remembered that night because the man handing her the money had been irritated and she had waited 4 minutes. Josie sat on the kitchen floor close to 5 o'clock in the morning and understood what she was holding. For 2 years, someone had been paying for something that happened 4 nights a week in the room behind the laundromat on Dean Street, and that person had been paying for it in the name of a company carrying the Castellano name. She didn't know what people did inside that room. She didn't need to know. She knew something simpler, and she knew it very well, because she had spent 7 years living under pieces of paper with her own name written on them, that when a name was placed somewhere it didn't belong, one day the person carrying that name would be made to pay. She closed the lid of the box. She showered, changed her clothes, woke Owen and told him to go to school as usual, and at 7:30 she drove the car with the cardboard window up the hill. Bertie opened the kitchen door and said nothing. She simply stepped aside. Rafe was standing at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and he set it down when he saw her. Josie placed the shoebox on the table between them. She said, "I'm not here to come back." She said, "I'm here because of my brother." Then she told him, briefly, completely, without one unnecessary word. 2 men in the school parking lot, the $41,000 figure given accurately down to the hundred, the offer to erase the debt, 2 trips from Pawtucket to Attleboro, the envelope and the key with the orange plastic tag. Rafe listened to all of it, and his expression didn't change, but Josie saw both of his hands come down onto the table and lie very flat against the wood. She opened the box. She took out 4 notebooks, opened them to the exact pages she had folded at the corners at 4 o'clock that morning, and pushed them across the table. She said, "Dean Street, behind the laundromat, 2 years, 4 nights a week," she said, "the name on the invoices." She didn't add another sentence to explain, because she looked at his face and knew no explanation was necessary. Rafe read the first page very slowly. Then he turned to the second page and read even more slowly. Josie spoke before he could open his mouth, and she said it in the same voice she used when writing a number into her notebook, without defending herself, without apologizing. She said, "I told you my terms. I don't carry anything for anyone. I don't hold anything for anyone. I don't stay in any room where business is being discussed. I'm breaking every one of those terms myself, right now, with my own hands." She said, "You need to know that I know." Rafe looked up from the notebook. He said, "I know you know." The meeting took place 6 days later, in the back room of a restaurant on Broadway Street that had closed at 3 o'clock that afternoon to prepare. 5 men sat around a round table. No one brought anything with them except paperwork. No one raised his voice. No one stood up. And during those 2 hours, what filled the room more than anything else were the long silences between sentences, the kind of silence people leave untouched, so that a piece of information has time to settle before anyone speaks again. Rafe didn't say a word about the 2 men in the school parking lot. He didn't mention the broken car window, the slashed tire, or the runs from Pawtucket. He knew that in this room, those things weren't arguments. They were private matters, and no one voted on private matters. He placed a file on the table and talked about 2 years. He said Dean Street, behind the laundromat, 4 nights a week, 23 consecutive months. He presented a comparison of expenses from a construction company bearing his family's name, a company that was licensed, held public contracts with the city, and underwent annual audits. He pointed to the regular payments going out from that company to an address where the company had never had any legitimate business. Then he made the only accusation of the entire meeting. He said he didn't care what Emile Falconetti did in that room. That was Emile's business. But Emile had been paying for it under a name that wasn't his, for 2 years, with records to prove it, and that name was attached to 3 city contracts, in which all 5 families represented at this table had a stake. He said if the day ever came when someone sat down and went through that company's books, the first person questioned wouldn't be Emile. He said that was why he had called everyone here instead of handling it himself. The other 4 men said nothing for a very long time. Emile Falconetti sat with his back straight and listened to all of it, and somewhere around the 20th minute he understood that there was no way out through paperwork. So he played the thing he had been holding for 3 years. He pushed his chair back slightly, looked around the table, then said, "Then tell them, Raphael, tell them who signed the order the night your brother died." The room went completely silent. Rafe didn't stand. He didn't change the way he was sitting. He let the silence remain long enough for everyone to hear the clock on the wall. Then he said Emile had held on to that sentence for 3 years, held it carefully, waited for the right moment, because Emile believed it was the thing Rafe feared most in the world. He said it wasn't. Then he said aloud the thing he had carried for 3 years. He said he had known since the 2nd month. He said the name once, without emphasis. He said he had possessed everything he needed to do, the thing every man sitting at that table had imagined he would do, and he had sat with it for 3 years and chosen not to. He gave the reason, and the reason was only one sentence: that there were 2 children in his house who had lost their father, and they needed an uncle who was still in the house, not an uncle sitting in prison. He said he had chosen that, every day, for 3 years, and he would choose it the same way again. Then he said one final thing, that the only man at this table who still believed that night could be used as something to bargain with was the man who had misunderstood him for 3 years. The other 4 men looked at one another. No one cast a vote aloud. The oldest man simply tapped 2 fingers against the tabletop twice and stopped, and everyone in the room understood what it meant. From that day forward, Emile Falconetti was removed from every shared operation. The jointly held companies were separated, and 2 men were assigned to review the entire 2 years of records. The engagement arrangement with the Falconetti family, which had existed on paper since before Gio died, was cancelled that same week. Adriana left Providence before the end of the month, and no one heard anything more about her except that she had gone to Manhattan. That night, Bertie came to Josie's apartment. She brought a box of pastries and didn't stay long. She sat at the kitchen table and told Josie something she had kept quiet for 4 years. She told her about the widow of an old driver in Cranston, who had received the same payment every month for the past 4 years to cover the cost of a caregiver, and the woman had no idea where the money came from, and Bertie knew because Bertie was the one who sent it. Then she told Josie about the night Gio died. She said the call came close to 1 o'clock in the morning, and Rafe's car pulled into the driveway at 1:40, and he sat inside it until nearly 5. She said she stood at the kitchen door, looking out for those entire 3 hours. She said when he finally came inside, daylight had already begun, and he didn't say anything at all. He only went upstairs and sat in the hallway waiting for the 2 girls to wake up so he could tell them himself. Then Bertie stood, put on her hat, and said one last thing at the door. She said, "He isn't cold. He's just careful about where he puts his warmth." Josie came on Friday night, after Bertie had gone home, and the 2 girls had gone upstairs, and she came because she had told Bertie she would. In the kitchen, only the small light above the sink was on. Rafe stood leaning against the edge of the table, and he didn't invite her to sit, and she didn't sit. He said he was going to tell her everything, from the beginning, and he wouldn't stop halfway through, no matter how she reacted. Then he told her the 9 days he had given Sal to investigate her, and the line on page 4 about a woman named Maeve Hardigan, who had cleaned the floors of the hall on Dean Street for 9 years, his brother's leather-bound notebook in the bottom drawer, and a line written in blue ballpoint ink 10 days before Gio died about taking care of Mrs. H's hospital bills and reminding Sal on Monday. He said that Monday never came. He told her about the 11 o'clock phone call to Emile Falconetti, asking to buy the entire neighborhood debt portfolio, and he said he had thought he was being clever, when in truth, he had just handed a 61-year-old man exactly the information he needed. Then he told her about that night, at the long wooden table, when she sat there talking about 11 rounds of chemotherapy and the house in Cranston, while he had already possessed every one of those numbers on paper for 3 weeks, and he had sat there and chosen not to tell her. He gave his reason, that he hadn't wanted her sitting inside this house, knowing she was being used as part of a bargain between two families. Then he said the next sentence without looking away. He said, "That was my reason. It wasn't good enough." He said he had lived by a rule that character is only proven when no one is watching, and he had held her to that standard on the corner of Atwell Street, but had failed to give her the same honesty in return. Josie listened to all of it. She said she was angry. She said she was angry about the 8 weeks, and angriest about that night at the long wooden table, because that was the only night in 7 years when she had told the story of her mother to someone she didn't believe was already holding a file about it. He said, "Good." She said she would forgive him, and she truly would, but not tonight. He said, "I'm not asking for tonight." Then Josie said she had 3 conditions. The first was the truth, all of it, including the parts that were hard to hear, including the parts he thought he was keeping from her to protect her, especially those parts. The second was that no one would make decisions for her, from either side, no agreements behind her back, no messages sent through someone else, no one coming to tell her where her place was. The third she said more slowly than the first 2. She said the $41,000 debt would not be erased as a gift, and it would not be treated as a debt left behind by someone who had died. It would become a formal loan agreement, on paper, with interest, with a repayment term, and she would pay it herself every month until it was finished. She said, "You can give to this entire city if you want, but I have to be able to stand on my own, because if I can't, then the woman standing beside you won't be me anymore." Rafe was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Those are fair terms." She said, "They're the only terms." He walked over, took her left hand, turned it palm up, and looked at the 2 old oil burns on her forearm, and he held her hand that way for a while, and he didn't say anything about them. They were married in March at Providence City Hall, with 11 people present. Owen adjusted his tie about 20 times during the ceremony. Poppy held tightly to the card she had drawn herself, and wouldn't let anyone else hold it for her. Tessa didn't cry. She stood very straight, and looked at Josie with an expression that wasn't quite approval, and wasn't quite relief. An expression that was entirely Tessa, and Josie understood it perfectly. On the steps outside, Estelle took Josie's hand and said exactly one thing, that for 30 years, she had been waiting for that family to finish paying a debt, and it turned out they had paid it in another way. 1 year later, there was a small diner on Atwell Street, with 22 seats, opening at 6 o'clock every morning. On paper, it belonged to Josephine Hartigan, purchased with a real bank loan, repaid over 7 years, with the application filed by her and every document signed by her own hand. Her mother's cast-iron skillet hung from a hook beside the kitchen door. Owen was in his 2nd year of college, and worked weekend shifts because he wanted to, not because he needed to. Poppy drew a picture of Josie standing with the skillet in her hand, drawn with the absolute confidence of a 9-year-old child regarding proportion, and Josie folded it and slipped it into her apron pocket. Estelle sat at the corner table every Tuesday morning, and Biscuit lay beneath the table on a towel folded into quarters. The shoemaker at the end of the street died last month, and someone paid the entire cost of the funeral for his family, and no one in the neighborhood knew who it was. Josie knew. She didn't say. On the counter beside the cash register sat a new notebook, hard-covered, spiral-bound. Every night before turning off the lights, she still sat down and recorded the day in full, in the same small, even block letters she had used for 11 years. Because decent people don't wait for someone to be watching. They don't wait to be thanked. They do what is right when no one sees. Then they do it again, and they don't ask anyone else to keep count for them. What a person does when they believe no one important is watching isn't the exception. It is the complete testimony of who they are. If Josie's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share, so that every day you can have more warm-hearted stories like this to listen to. How did today's story make you feel? And what part of it made you think about your own life? Please leave a comment, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.